The letter was sitting on my doorstep when I got home from the grocery store. Clean white envelope, official HOA letterhead, my name typed in perfect black letters. Inside, 3 words that made my blood run cold. Violation notice. Immediate action required. They wanted my mural painted over within 72 hours. The one I'd spent 6 months creating with my own hands. The one that meant more to me than anything I owned. But what they didn't know, what these suburban rule makers couldn't possibly understand, was that every brushstroke on that wall told a story they'd never heard. Every color, every shadow, every carefully placed detail represented something they'd dismiss as just another veteran's emotional outburst. They saw graffiti. They saw property values dropping. They had no idea they were staring at a memorial. They had no idea that 3 names painted in that corner weren't just random letters. They were my brothers. And they had no idea that the woman marching toward my front door with a clipboard and a smug expression was about to learn exactly why some battles are worth fighting twice. Because sometimes the real war doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes it starts in your own neighborhood, with people who've never heard a shot fired in anger telling you what your sacrifice is worth. Sometimes the enemy isn't across an ocean or hiding in mountains. Sometimes the enemy is standing at your front door with a clipboard, telling you that your pain doesn't fit their aesthetic standards. Welcome to Heartland Tales, where we uncover the remarkable truths hidden behind ordinary moments. Before we dive into this powerful story of one veteran's fight to honor fallen comrades, tell us in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. If you believe these voices deserve to be amplified, please consider subscribing to support our growing community. We sincerely appreciate every single one of you. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association took pride in their reputation. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched down every street like green carpets. Mailboxes matched. Garden borders followed precise specifications. Property values had climbed steadily for 8 years running, and the board intended to keep it that way. Marcus Chun had been living in Unit 247 for 14 months. His house sat at the end of Oakwood Drive, backing up against a small wooded area that most residents found charming. He kept his grass cut, his driveway swept, his garbage can stored exactly where the regulations specified. For over a year, he'd been the invisible neighbor. Quiet, punctual with his HOA fees, never causing problems. But 6 months ago, something changed. Residents walking their dogs began noticing activity in his backyard. The sound of scraping, the smell of primer, the sight of tarps covering something against his rear fence. Some assumed he was doing standard home maintenance. Others wondered if he was planning a garden renovation. What none of them realized was that they were witnessing the birth of something sacred. Chen worked methodically, carefully. Each evening after his shift at the construction company, he would change into old clothes, gather his brushes, and disappear into his backyard until darkness fell. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of him through the fence slats, bent over his work with the kind of focus that suggested this wasn't casual hobby painting. This was something else entirely. Something that demanded precision, respect, reverence. The first colors to appear were earth tones, browns and tans that seemed to capture actual soil, actual rock formations. Then came the greens, layer upon layer building vegetation so realistic that birds occasionally tried to perch on painted branches. Chun mixed his own colors, studying reference photographs for hours to achieve exact matches. Every shade had to be perfect because every shade represented a memory he couldn't afford to get wrong. Margaret Hoffman, the HOA president, first noticed the colors from her second-floor bedroom window. Splashes of green and brown, hints of red, what looked like random paint splotches covering a large section of Chen's back fence. She made a note to investigate. The community guidelines were clear about exterior modifications. Residents needed approval for anything visible from neighboring properties. She'd tried, calling first. Chen never answered. She'd knocked on his front door twice. No response. His truck was always in the driveway, but he seemed to avoid contact. Margaret began to suspect he was deliberately hiding something unsavory. In her 15 years as HOA president, she'd seen this pattern before. Residents who thought rules didn't apply to them. People who believed their property rights trumped community standards. What Margaret couldn't have known was that Chun did hear her knocks. He heard her calls. But he was deep in a place where HOA regulations couldn't reach, where community guidelines held no authority. He was back in Afghanistan, reliving moments that had shaped every day since his return. Each brushstroke was a conversation with ghosts, each color choice a prayer for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. On quiet evenings, when the neighborhood settled into suburban silence, Chen would stand before his growing mural and remember voices. James Morrison's laugh when someone told a bad joke. David Kim's habit of humming while cleaning his rifle. Michael Santos talking about his little sister's upcoming quinceañera, planning to surprise her with a traditional dress when he got home. 3 young men who would never get home because Marcus Chen wasn't walking point the day they died. The guilt was a weight he carried in his chest, pressing against his ribs every morning when he woke up breathing air they would never breathe again. The mural wasn't art therapy or creative expression. It was penance. It was the only way he knew to honor promises made to grieving mothers who had every right to hate him but chose forgiveness instead. The complaints started arriving 3 weeks later. Anonymous emails about unsightly artwork visible from the walking trail behind Chen's house. Phone calls from concerned neighbors worried about property values. One resident claimed the colors were aggressive and disturbing. Another suggested the painting might contain inappropriate content. A third complained that the military-looking imagery made them uncomfortable during their evening walks. These complaints revealed something ugly beneath Meadowbrook Estate's manicured surface. Many residents had opinions about military service that they'd never voiced directly. Some viewed veterans as damaged goods, potential problems waiting to explode. Others saw military imagery as inherently threatening, associating uniforms with violence rather than protection. Most simply preferred their patriotism abstract and comfortable, displayed through flag decals and Memorial Day barbecues rather than confronted with the actual cost of their freedom. Margaret scheduled a formal inspection. She gathered the compliance committee, armed herself with community guidelines, and prepared for what she expected would be a straightforward violation notice. They'd seen fence murals before, usually amateur attempts at artistic expression that violated multiple aesthetic standards. This would be no different. Document the violations, issue the notice, collect the fines, restore order. But as they approached Chen's fence, something in the air changed. The closer they got, the more details emerged that challenged their assumptions. This wasn't amateur artwork. This wasn't random decoration. This was something created by someone who understood exactly what they were painting, someone who had been there, someone who remembered everything. They had no idea what they were walking toward. The mural covered nearly 40 feet of fence. From a distance, it looked abstract. Swirls of jungle green, desert tan, patches of deep crimson that seemed to move in the afternoon light. But as Margaret and her committee stepped closer, details began to emerge that made them uncomfortable without understanding why. What they'd mistaken for random paint was actually landscape. Dense vegetation that seemed too real, too precise. Mountains in the background that suggested specific geography. A sky that carried weight, heavy with something they couldn't identify. And in the corner, barely visible unless you knew where to look, 3 names written in careful script. The brushwork itself told a story Margaret couldn't read. Each section of the mural had been painted with different techniques, different emotional intensity. The vegetation was meticulous, almost photographic in its accuracy. The sky showed evidence of multiple layers, colors built up over weeks to capture specific atmospheric conditions. The rocky terrain revealed understanding of geology, of how weathering affects stone, of how light falls across mountain faces at different times of day. But it was the empty spaces that carried the most weight. Areas where the fence showed through, not because the painting was incomplete, but because those spaces meant something. They represented absence, loss, places where figures should have been standing but would never stand again. The negative space was as carefully planned as every painted detail, creating a memorial language that spoke to anyone who had ever counted missing friends. Margaret pulled out her camera, snapping photos for the violation report. The committee members whispered among themselves, debating HOA statute references and precedent cases. None of them bothered to look closely enough to see the small American flag painted discreetly near the bottom right corner. None of them noticed the date written in tiny numbers just below it. None of them recognized the GPS coordinates painted in even smaller script beneath the 3 names. The flag wasn't a generic patriotic symbol. It was weathered, faded in specific ways that suggested extended exposure to harsh conditions. The stars weren't perfectly aligned because real flags in combat zones never maintain perfect alignment. The fabric showed tears in exact locations because Chun remembered every detail of the flag they had raised after recovering their fallen brothers. Nothing in this mural was generic or symbolic. Everything was documentary precision painted from memory that refused to fade. "This is exactly what we feared," Margaret announced to her committee. "Unauthorized exterior decoration, violation of community aesthetic standards, failure to obtain proper approval. Clear violation of sections 4.2, 4.7, and 8.1 of our community guidelines." Committee member David Walsh nodded agreement, already calculating the fine structure. "We'll need documentation, official notice, and a timeline for compliance. Standard procedure." But committee member Sarah Rodriguez hesitated. Something about the mural bothered her in a different way. Not the violation aspects, but something deeper. The precision of the brushwork. The emotional weight carried in every color choice. She'd seen military artwork before. Her brother had served in Afghanistan. This looked familiar. "Maybe we should talk to him first," Sarah suggested quietly. "Find out what this is about before we issue citations." Margaret dismissed the suggestion immediately. "Rules are rules, Sarah. We don't make exceptions based on artistic intent. Either residents follow community guidelines, or they pay the consequences." The violation notice was drafted that afternoon. Formal language demanding immediate compliance. Chun had 72 hours to restore the affected fence area to community standards, or face escalating fines and potential legal action. The letter was delivered personally, placed prominently on his front doorstep, where he couldn't miss it. What they didn't see was Chun reading that letter while sitting at his kitchen table, hands shaking slightly, jaw set with determination they'd underestimated. What they didn't see was him walking back to his mural that evening, standing quietly in front of 40 feet of memories, making a decision that would change everything. That night, Chun did something he hadn't done since returning from Afghanistan. He called his old unit. Men he'd served with, brothers who understood what Helmand Province took from all of them, soldiers who knew exactly what those three names meant. Word spread through networks that civilians never see, through group texts and veteran organizations, and informal chains of communication that connect those who've shared foxholes and firefights. By morning, Chin's phone was buzzing with messages. Brothers offering to drive from 3 states away. Veterans groups asking how they could help. Gold Star mothers sending prayers and support. A community that Margaret Hoffman didn't know existed was mobilizing around a mural she'd dismissed as suburban graffiti. Chin also made another call that night, to a number he'd memorized but rarely dialed. Mrs. Morrison answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting for someone to call about her son James. "They want me to paint over it," Chin told her quietly. The silence stretched across phone lines connecting a veteran's kitchen to a Gold Star mother's living room, too. People bound by grief that suburban HOA presidents would never understand. "What do you want to do?" Mrs. Morrison finally asked. "I want to fight," Chin admitted. "But I don't know if it's worth putting you and the other families through more pain." Mrs. Morrison's voice was steady when she answered. "Marcus, my son died fighting for freedom. If you don't fight for the right to remember him, what did he die for?" Because Marcus Chun had spent 10 years learning exactly what was worth fighting for. And some fights, he'd learned, require more than just following orders. Margaret arrived at Chin's house exactly at 9 a.m., 3 days after the violation notice deadline. She'd brought David Walsh for witness purposes and a contractor referral to help speed the restoration process. She'd also prepared a formal fine assessment and the next steps in their enforcement procedure. The mural was still there, untouched. She marched to the front door and knocked firmly. This time, footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a man in his mid-30s, average height, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked tired but not defeated. His eyes carried something Margaret couldn't immediately identify. "Mr. Chun, I'm Margaret Hoffman, HOA president. I assume you received our violation notice?" "I did," Chun replied quietly. "Then you understand you're now facing significant fines and potential legal action." The committee voted unanimously. "That mural needs to come down immediately." Chun studied her for a moment, then glanced at David Walsh standing behind her with his clipboard and camera. "Can I show you something first?" Margaret checked her watch impatiently. Mr. Chun, this isn't a negotiation. Community guidelines don't have exceptions for personal artistic preferences. Just 5 minutes, Chun said. Then you can do whatever you think is appropriate. Something in his tone made Margaret hesitate. Not pleading, not anger, but something else. David shrugged and nodded. They followed Chun around the side of his house, toward the backyard. The mural looked different up close. What had seemed like abstract decoration from a distance revealed itself as something far more specific. The jungle vegetation wasn't random tropical plants. It was precise recreation of terrain from Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The mountains matched satellite imagery from Forward Operating Base Chapman. The sky carried the particular weight of dust and smoke that anyone who'd served there would recognize instantly. But it was the details that stopped Margaret's planned speech cold. Barely visible in the dense painted foliage, she could now see figures. Soldiers moving through vegetation so realistic she could almost hear the sound of boots on rocky soil. Equipment rendered with technical precision that suggested intimate familiarity. And in the center, where 3 paths converged near a rocky outcropping, 3 names written in careful memorial script. SGT James Morrison, age 23. CPL David Kim, age 21. PFC Michael Santos, age 19. Below the names, a date. October 15, 2018. Margaret's clipboard lowered slowly. David stopped taking pictures. Chin walked to the fence, placed his hand gently against the painted mountain range. This is the exact view from our observation post on Hill 2419. These 3 men died on a patrol I was supposed to lead. I was pulled back for radio duty at the last minute. They walked into an ambush meant for me. He paused, looking at the precise recreation of terrain that haunted his dreams every night. I painted every rock, every tree, every shadow exactly as I remember it, because forgetting any detail would be betraying their sacrifice. This isn't decoration. This is documentation. Margaret found herself studying the mural with different eyes. What she'd seen as random splashes of color now revealed itself as topographical accuracy that could only come from someone who had walked that ground, slept under that sky, breathed that air. The emotional weight she'd felt but couldn't identify was grief transformed into art, trauma converted into memorial. Chun turned to face Margaret and David, both now standing completely still. I've been painting this mural for 6 months. Every evening after work. Every weekend. Not because I wanted to violate your community guidelines, but because these men saved my life by dying in my place. And I promised their mothers I'd never forget exactly where it happened. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Chin reached into his back pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. From it, he extracted several documents. Military discharge papers, commendation citations, letters from Gold Star mothers thanking him for his service, and a photograph showing 4 young soldiers standing at the exact location now painted on his fence. But it was the final document that stopped Margaret's world completely. A letter of recommendation written by a colonel describing Sergeant Marcus Chen's actions during the ambush that killed his 3 brothers. How Chun had disobeyed orders to stay at the radio, running into enemy fire to retrieve their bodies. How he'd carried each man out individually, under continuous assault, refusing to leave anyone behind. How he'd held the position for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived, ensuring no other soldiers would die in that killing ground. The letter described a man who had earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for actions he never talked about, medals that sat in a drawer, because wearing them felt like celebrating the worst day of his life. It described a hero who saw himself as a failure, a survivor who carried guilt heavier than any medal. The American flag down there, Chin continued, pointing to the discreet flag in the corner, is positioned exactly where we planted one after we recovered their bodies. The date is when they died. The landscape is their final resting place before Arlington. He handed Margaret a letter from one of the mothers. She read silently, her hands beginning to shake slightly. Mrs. Morrison wrote this last month, Chin explained quietly. She drove 8 hours to see the mural. She said it was the first time since her son's funeral that she felt like someone understood what he died for. Margaret's clipboard fell to the ground. David Walsh, who had been preparing to document violations, slowly removed his hat. And in that moment, standing in front of 40 feet of grief transformed into art, two HOA committee members began to understand the difference between rules and respect. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for that evening. Margaret had spent the afternoon making phone calls, not to lawyers or contractors, but to every committee member who had voted for the violation notice. She'd also called Sarah Rodriguez, who had suggested talking to Chen first. Word had spread through Meadowbrook Estates faster than anyone expected. Neighbors who had complained about the unsightly artwork began appearing at Chen's fence throughout the day. Some brought flowers. Others simply stood quietly, reading the names painted in the corner. One elderly resident, a Korean War veteran, stood at attention and saluted. By 6 p.m., the walking trail behind Chen's house had become an impromptu memorial gathering. People who had never spoken to each other were sharing stories, asking questions, learning about places like Helmand Province and Forward Operating Base Chapman. Margaret opened the evening meeting with an apology she'd never planned to give. "We made a mistake," she announced to the packed community room. "A serious mistake based on assumptions we had no right to make. Mr. Chen's mural isn't a violation of community standards. It's a memorial to American heroes, created by someone who served alongside them." She paused, looking at faces in the audience that reflected the same shame she felt. The board votes unanimously to rescind all violations, remove all fines, and formally apologize to Mr. Chen for our failure to understand what we were looking at. David Walsh stood next. "I motion that we designate Mr. Chen's mural as a protected community memorial, with full HOA support for maintenance and preservation." The motion passed without discussion. Sarah Rodriguez, who had suggested patience from the beginning, made the final motion of the evening. "I move that we establish a new community guideline. Any resident with military service who wishes to create memorial artwork will receive full board support and assistance." Unanimous approval. Marcus Chen hadn't attended the meeting. He'd spent the evening sitting quietly in his backyard, watching neighbors discover the stories painted on his fence. He didn't need vindication. He hadn't painted the mural for recognition or approval. He'd painted it for three men who would never see another sunset. But as he watched Margaret Hoffman approach his front door the next morning, this time carrying flowers instead of violation notices, he realized something important. Sometimes the battle to honor the dead requires fighting the living. And sometimes, when you stand firm for the right reasons, even suburban HOA presidents can learn the difference between rules and respect. Margaret knocked gently on his door. When he answered, she extended the flowers and something else. A small bronze plaque reading, "In honor of SGT James Morrison, CPL David Kim, and PFC Michael Santos. Remembered by their brother, Marcus Chen. Protected by the Meadowbrook Estates community." "For the fence," she said quietly. "So everyone knows this is sacred ground." Chen accepted the plaque, nodded once, and watched as Margaret walked back toward her car. She paused at the end of his driveway, turned back toward the fence, and saluted. The mural remains today, protected by community resolution and maintained with neighborhood pride. Visitors leave flags, flowers, and notes of gratitude. Local schools bring students to learn about service and sacrifice. The walking trail behind Chen's house has become known as Memorial Path. But the most important change isn't visible from any angle. It's the understanding that sometimes what looks like rebellion is actually remembrance. Sometimes what appears to violate community standards actually honors the highest standards of all. And sometimes the person you think is causing problems is actually solving the biggest problem of all, forgetting. Marcus Chen never asked for recognition. He didn't paint his mural for praise or attention. He painted it because some promises to the dead are more important than HOA regulations. He painted it because 3 young men died carrying his weight, and forgetting their sacrifice would be the real violation. But sometimes, when you stand firm for honor instead of convenience, the world surprises you. Sometimes suburban neighbors become protectors instead of prosecutors. Sometimes HOA presidents learn that the most beautiful property improvements can't be measured in market values. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe a veteran in your family, a neighbor who served quietly, or someone whose sacrifice went unnoticed until it was almost too late. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day thanks to viewers who believe that human stories matter, especially the ones that remind us what real honor looks like. We'll see you in the next one.